Everyone on the yacht heard the champagne. Only one waitress heard the child. Above the Hudson River, the Harrington Star glowed like a floating hotel, all ivory lights, polished rails, and music soft enough to make wealth feel gentle. The Manhattan skyline shimmered beyond the glass, every window a small square of gold against the dark. On the upper deck, William Harrington stood in an ivory-white blazer with a champagne flute raised near his chest, his calm smile aimed at investors, city officials, and guests who had come to watch a millionaire celebrate another perfect launch. He owned resort properties from Maine to Florida. He owned 6 luxury vessels. He owned the kind of reputation that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. But he did not own the night, not really. Not the part happening below the music. Grace Miller moved through the deck with a silver tray balanced on one hand, her blonde hair tied back with a wine-red ribbon, her white waitress blouse crisp despite the long shift. Most guests did not notice her face. They noticed the champagne when they wanted another glass. They noticed her only when she was in the way. That was fine with Grace. She had learned that quiet people could see more. A woman near the rail laughed too loudly and let a flute slip from her fingers. It did not break. It rolled under a table, spilling champagne across the polished floor. Everyone laughed because nothing expensive had been ruined. Grace knelt, wiped the floor, lifted the glass, and stood again. That was when she heard it. Small, thin, almost swallowed by the string quartet and the river wind. She turned her head toward the service stairs. Nothing. Then the guests laughed again, and the sound vanished beneath them. Grace, the event manager hissed from beside the bar. Table 12 needs refills. Grace blinked once and resumed walking, but her attention stayed below deck. She had spent 3 years working in a family support center before life pulled her into catering shifts and overdue bills. She knew the difference between metal groaning and a child trying not to cry. Above her, Will Harrington began his speech. "Tonight is about vision," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, steady. "About building places where families can gather, rest, and feel safe." Applause warmed the deck. Grace stopped near the service station. There it was again. A muffled cry. Closer now. Or maybe she had finally stopped pretending she could ignore it. She looked around. No one else had reacted. A security guard stood near the stairway, eyes on the guests, not the shadows below. A server brushed past Grace with a tray of oysters. "You okay?" he whispered. Grace did not answer. The cry came again, followed by one tiny word, broken by distance and fear. "Daddy." Grace's fingers tightened around the tray until the silver edge pressed into her palm. On the far side of the deck, Will lifted his glass higher, speaking about safety while his own daughter, Sophie Harrington, was supposed to be asleep in a private family cabin with her nanny. Grace did not know that yet. She only knew what everyone else had missed. A child was below. A child was crying. And the music above was too beautiful for anyone powerful to hear the truth beneath it. The event manager stepped toward her. "Grace, where are you going?" She set the tray down carefully, one glass at a time, as if even urgency deserved calm hands. "Someone needs help. The guests need service." Grace looked toward the stairwell, where the light changed from gold to a dim blue glow. "No," she said softly. "Someone needs help more." Then she walked away from the champagne, down the narrow stairs, following the sound no one had wanted to hear. The stairwell swallowed the gold light one step at a time. Above Grace, the applause faded into a soft, expensive thunder. Below her, the yacht changed. The polished warmth of the upper deck gave way to narrow corridors, low blue safety lights, and the steady hum of engines hidden behind sealed panels. The air smelled like metal, salt, and cleaning solution. Grace kept one hand on the rail and moved quickly, but not recklessly. Panic made noise. Noise frightened children. She paused at the first landing and listened. Nothing but machinery. Then a breath. Small. Shaking. To her left. She followed it past stacked linen carts and a locked storage cage, past a sign that read crew access only, until she reached a service hallway near the maintenance rooms. The cry came again, weaker this time. "Daddy." Grace crouched near a white door with a small round window. Inside, a little girl sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, a damp cloth doll pressed under one arm. Her pale hair had slipped loose from a ribbon, and her blue eyes were wide with the frightened patience of a child trying very hard to be brave. Grace kept her voice low. "Hi, sweetheart. My name is Grace. I am right here." The girl looked toward the window, blinking through tears. I cannot open it. Grace tried the handle. It did not move. She looked at the keypad beside the frame, then at the small red light above it. Locked from the outside. Not an emergency failure. A safety lock engaged after the door had closed. What is your name? Grace asked. Sophie. The name landed in Grace's chest before she understood why. Sophie Harrington. Well, Harrington's daughter. The little girl from the framed photo Grace had seen early. The first maintenance worker arrived breathing hard, a key ring in one hand and a tablet in the other. His name patch read Luis, and his eyes widened when he saw Grace crouched beside the compartment door with her palm still pressed to the glass. Inside, Sophie had stopped crying, but her face remained pale, her small fingers spread against the window as if Grace's hand were the only thing keeping the room from becoming too large. Override panel is here, Grace said, pointing without standing. The instructions say exterior release only. Do not force the handle. Luis gave her a quick look, surprised by the clarity in her voice. You work maintenance? No. I read the sign. He nodded once, then knelt beside the keypad. The radio crackled again. This time the bridge captain came through. Confirm child identity. Grace answered before the manager could interrupt. Sophie Harrington, approximately 6 years old, conscious, responsive, says she is not injured, frightened but breathing normally. A pause. Then the captain's voice changed. Mr. Harrington has been notified. Above deck, the announcement had stopped. Well, Harrington lowered his champagne glass in the middle of a sentence because Daniel Price had leaned close and whispered 7 words that turned the entire yacht cold around him. Sophie is missing from the family cabin. For a moment, Will did not understand. His mind rejected the words because they did not belong under soft lights and polite applause. Then the nanny appeared near the side entrance, face white, hands twisting together, saying Sophie had been resting. Then she was not. That she must have slipped out looking for her bracelet. The flute in Will's hand lowered before anyone noticed his fingers had gone tight around the stem. Where is she? He asked. Daniel listened to his earpiece, then looked at him. Lower starboard corridor. A waitress found her. Will was already moving. Guest stepped aside as he crossed the deck, his ivory blazer flashing under the lights. Behind him, conversations broke into fragments. Someone asked if the child was hurt. Someone else asked if the party should continue. No one had an answer worth saying. Below, Luis entered the code. The red light stayed red. He tried again. Grace looked through the glass. Sophie, keep your eyes on me. Is Daddy coming? Yes, Grace said, though she had not seen him yet. But right now, you and I are doing very well. Sophie nodded with the solemn pride of a child who needed to believe bravery had rules. Luis tapped the tablet, muttered something about a delayed lock cycle, then spoke into his radio. I need bridge override. B7 is stuck in safety hold. Grace heard footsteps pounding down the corridor. Not running wildly. Controlled, but fast. Will appeared at the far end with Daniel behind him and the captain close after. The millionaire's face was no longer polished. It was stripped down to fear held tightly in public hands. He saw Grace first, crouched on the floor in a waitress uniform, wine-red ribbon loose against her cheek. Then he saw Sophie through the small round window. Everything in him stopped. Sophie. The child turned her head. Daddy. Will stepped toward the door, but Grace lifted one hand without taking her eyes off S. The door opened with a soft mechanical click, and Sophie did not move at first. She sat on the floor with her doll in her arms, blinking at the sudden hallway light as if she needed to make sure the world outside was real. Grace stayed low, keeping her voice gentle. You did it, Sophie. The door is open now. Only then did the little girl stand, unsteady from fear more than anything else, and step across the threshold. Will lowered himself instantly, arms open, but Sophie turned first toward Grace and wrapped both arms around her neck. The corridor went completely still. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second and held the child carefully, one hand resting between Sophie's shoulders, the other smoothing the hair away from her damp cheek. You were very brave, Grace whispered. Sophie clung tighter. You stayed. I said I would. Will watched from only a few feet away, and the sentence entered him more deeply than any accusation could have. He had promised Sophie he would bring her up to see the lights after his speech. He had promised 5 more minutes. He had promised the way busy fathers promise, with love in the heart and a schedule already breaking the words. Grace had promised through a locked door and kept it. Sophie finally reached for him, and Will gathered her into his arms with a carefulness that made his expensive blazer crease against the metal wall. He pressed his cheek to her hair, breathing once as if he had forgotten how. "I am here," he said. Sophie's voice was small against his shoulder. "I called." Will shut his eyes. "I know. Nobody came." The words were not cruel. They were worse. They were true. Will opened his eyes and looked at Grace. She had stood now, brushing dust from her black skirt, trying to make herself small again as the captain, Daniel, Luis, and the event manager filled the corridor with adult explanations. "The safety lock engaged automatically," the captain said. "We will review the system." The event manager added quickly, "The staff should not have left the upper deck during service, but she seemed to think there was something below, and before we could redirect her." Grace said nothing. She did not need to. Sophie lifted her head from Will's shoulder. "No, Daddy." "She heard me." The manager stopped speaking. Sophie pointed one small finger toward Grace. "She heard me when nobody else did." The corridor fell into the kind of silence that does not come from fear, but from shame arriving all at once. Will looked at the manager, then at the security guard who had ignored the stairwell, then at the captain whose systems had failed quietly under a party built on the word safety. "No one redirects a person who reports a child in distress," Will said. His voice was low, controlled, final. The manager's face lost color. "Of course, sir." "No one." Will adjusted Sophie in his arms and turned back to Grace. "Thank you." Grace met his eyes. "She needs water and a quiet place. Maybe a nurse should check her, just to be safe." Will nodded immediately. "Daniel." "Already calling," Daniel said, phone in hand. Grace stepped back to let them pass, but Sophie reached over Will's shoulder and caught the edge of Grace's sleeve. "Come too." Grace looked at Will, not asking permission for herself, but making sure the child would not be pulled from the person who had steadied her. Will understood. Maybe not fully, but enough. "Please," he said. They walked back toward the stairs together. No champagne, no music, only the sound of footsteps against the metal floor. As they climbed, the gold light returned gradually, spilling down from the world above. On the upper deck, guests turned when Will appeared carrying Sophie, with Grace beside them in her waitress uniform and wine-red ribbon. The string quartet stopped. Conversations died. Will stepped into the center of his own party, holding his daughter close, and for the first time all night, every person on the yacht looked at the woman they had not bothered to see. The upper deck did not know what to do with silence. It had been designed for music, speeches, laughter, and the clean sound of champagne meeting crystal. It had not been designed for a millionaire holding his frightened daughter while a waitress stood beside him with dust on her skirt and a wine-red ribbon slipping loose from her hair. Will felt every eye on him, but for once, the attention meant nothing. Sophie's arms were wrapped around his neck, her breathing uneven but steadier now, and Grace stood close enough for the child to see her without reaching. The woman who had dropped the champagne flute earlier leaned toward a friend, then stopped when Will looked her way. Daniel came quickly through the crowd with a nurse from the guest list, a retired pediatric doctor who had been attending with her husband. "May I check her?" the woman asked gently. Will looked at Sophie. "Sweetheart, this doctor just wants to make sure you are okay." Sophie's fingers tightened in his blazer. Her eyes went to Grace. Grace crouched to her level. "I will stand right here," she said. That was enough. Sophie nodded. They settled her on a cushioned bench near the railing, away from the crowd. The doctor checked her pulse, her breathing, her temperature, and asked simple questions in a voice soft enough not to turn care into spectacle. "She appears frightened and tired, but stable," the doctor said after a few minutes. "Water, rest, and a quiet room. I would still recommend a full checkup tomorrow." Will nodded. "It will be done." Grace handed Sophie a cup of water before anyone else moved. Not because she wanted to be seen doing it, because the child needed water. Sophie drank slowly, both hands around the cup. Will watched the simple act and felt shame rise again, quiet and sharp. He had built an entire business around comfort and safety, yet the person who knew what his daughter needed first was the waitress his system had tried to send back to service. The event manager hovered near the bar, face pale, clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. "Mr. Harrington," he said carefully, "we can resume the announcement after a brief pause, if you would prefer to reassure the guests." Will looked at him, then at the champagne tower, then at Sophie, who was leaning against Grace's side while the doctor packed her bag. No, he said. The manager blinked. No, sir. We'll step toward the center of the deck. His champagne flute still sat on a nearby table, untouched, pale bubbles dying against the glass. He did not pick it up. He did not smile for the guests. He did not soften the truth into something more comfortable. The announcement is canceled, he said. A ripple moved through the crowd. Will continued, his voice calm, carrying across the deck without. The family cabin was quieter than the deck, but not silent. The yacht still hummed beneath the floor. Water brushed against the hull. Far above, guests spoke in lowered voices, as if the entire vessel had become a place where loudness felt disrespectful. Sophie sat on the sofa beneath a soft blanket, sipping water through a straw while Grace knelt nearby and adjusted the cup so her small hands would not spill it. Will stood near the doorway, watching without stepping in too quickly. He had spent years entering rooms as the person everyone made space for. Now he was learning to wait at the edge of one. Sophie looked at him over the rim of the cup. Are you mad? Will's face changed. No, sweetheart. Because I went downstairs. He crossed the room slowly and sat on the low table in front of her, keeping his voice steady. I am not mad at you. I am sorry I did not know you were scared. Sophie's eyes moved to Grace. She knew. Will nodded. She did. Grace rose, smoothing her skirt. She recognized what she heard. That is all. Will looked at her. That is not all. Grace did not answer. Praise made her uncomfortable when a child was still tired. The nurse had left instructions on the side table, and Daniel had arranged for the nanny to wait in another cabin until Will decided what came next. Sophie leaned back against the pillow, eyelids heavy. Grace told me to breathe like pancakes. Will glanced at Grace, confused for one soft second. Blueberry pancakes, Sophie added. Important detail. Grace almost smiled. Will did smile, but it hurt a little. There were whole languages of comfort his daughter knew from other people because he had been busy speaking the language of investors. Then tomorrow, he said, we will get blueberry pancakes after your checkup. Sophie opened one eye. You have to come. I will. No speech. No speech. No champagne. Will looked at the untouched glass he had carried into the cabin without realizing it, then set it on the counter far from her. No champagne. Sophie seemed satisfied and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing evened out. Grace lowered the cabin lights slightly and tucked the blanket more securely around her. The motion was practiced, gentle, and completely unperformed. Will watched it with the same attention he should have given every safety briefing, every child care plan, every small request from his daughter that had been postponed because something larger had seemed more urgent. You said you worked with children before, he said softly. Grace looked toward the sleeping girl before answering. Family support center. After-school programs. Crisis intake. Mostly listening. Why did you leave? Her fingers touched the wine-red ribbon at the back of her hair, tightening a knot that was already secure. My younger brother got sick. I needed steadier money. Catering paid more if I took the late events. We'll absorb that. Another life hidden behind a uniform. Another history his world had not asked about. I want you to consult on the safety review. Grace turned. I am a waitress, Mr. Harrington. Tonight, you were the only person on this yacht who understood the emergency. Because I listened. Then teach us how to do that. She studied him carefully, searching for performance, for guilt trying to dress itself as generosity. Do not make me a symbol because you feel ashamed. Will lowered his eyes. The sentence was clean and deserved. Then help me make the system better because you are right. Outside the small window, Manhattan lights trembled on dark water. Grace looked at Sophie, asleep at last, doll tucked under one arm. I will give you one meeting, she said. Paid fairly. No cameras. No story about a heroic waitress. Agreed. And the training starts with the staff who get ignored first. Servers, cleaners, kitchen runners, deckhands. The people closest to the floor often hear things before executives do. Will nodded. That may be the most useful sentence anyone has said on this yacht. Grace picked up her tray from the side counter, though no one had asked her to return to service. Habit lived in the body. Will noticed and stepped aside, not blocking the door, not assuming she would stay. Grace. She paused. Thank you for not waiting for permission. Her face softened only slightly. Children should not have to wait for adults to decide whose voice matters. Then she walked out into the blue-lit corridor, leaving Will beside his sleeping daughter, the cooling champagne, and the first honest silence of the night. By the time the Harrington Star docked just after midnight, the party had become something smaller than an event and larger than gossip. Guests stepped onto the marina in quiet clusters, carrying their coats, their phones, and the uncomfortable knowledge that a waitress had done what the polished system around them failed to do. Grace stayed until the last service cart was counted, because leaving a job unfinished felt wrong even after the job itself had nearly ignored a child. Her feet ached. Her shoulders felt heavy. The wine-red ribbon in her hair had loosened, but she tied it again in the reflection of a dark galley window and kept moving. Near the staff exit, the event manager waited with a clipboard he no longer seemed brave enough to hold like authority. "Grace," he said, avoiding her eyes. "About earlier. I was under pressure." Grace looked at him. So was the child. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. He swallowed and stepped aside. Outside, the marina air was cold and damp, smelling of river water and diesel. Grace pulled her thin coat around herself and started toward the rideshare pickup zone, where the pavement glowed under yellow lights. She had almost reached the gate when Will's voice called her name. Not Miss. Not Server. Her name. She stopped. He approached without the crowd, without Daniel, without the ivory blazer button-like armor. He carried it over one arm now, his shirt sleeves slightly creased, his face tired in a way money could not edit. "Sophie is sleeping," he said. "The nurse checked her again before we docked. We are taking her for a full exam in the morning." Grace nodded. "Good." He glanced toward the yacht, then back at her. "I meant what I said about the safety review. I meant what I said about one meeting. Paid fairly. No cameras. Staff first. And no speech about how you discovered the value of ordinary people." That struck him, but he accepted it. No speech. A car rolled past the gate, tires whispering over wet pavement. Grace shifted her bag higher on her shoulder. Will noticed how small it was. One uniform folded inside. A pair of worn flats. A paperback with a bent cover. A life carried compactly because space cost money. "I also wanted to offer a reward," he said carefully. Her face closed before he finished. "Mr. Harrington, please let me finish." She waited, not warmly. Not a public reward. Not a check handed over in front of photographers. "If you have debt, family needs, anything practical, I can help." Grace breathed out slowly. "You are trying to make gratitude feel useful." He looked down. "Maybe. Then make it useful for the next child." Will lifted his eyes. Grace pointed back toward the yacht. "Better locks. Better monitors. Better staff training. A rule that no warning gets dismissed because the person reporting it is holding a tray. Put the money there." The marina lights reflected in his eyes. "And you?" She gave a tired, almost sad smile. "I have survived without becoming a headline. I would like to continue." For a moment, the river moved quietly beside them. Then Will nodded, not as a man agreeing to look generous, but as a father hearing the shape of responsibility. "All right." Grace turned to leave, but he spoke again. "Sophie asked if she would see you." Grace paused. The professional calm in her face softened at the child's name. "Tell her I am glad she is safe. She said you promised to stay." Grace looked toward the yacht, where one cabin light still glowed low. "I stayed until the door opened." She may remember that for a long time. Grace adjusted the strap of her bag. "Then make sure the rest of what she remembers is you showing up after." Will had no answer polished enough for that, so he gave the only one that mattered. "I will." A rideshare pulled to the curb. Grace opened the door, then looked back once. "Children hear more than we think," she said, "even when they are quiet." Then she got in and closed the door gently. Will stood under the marina light as the car pulled away, holding his blazer over one arm and the weight of her words in the other. Above the dock, the yacht still glowed beautifully. But now he knew beauty was not safety. Music was not attention. And a father's promise was only real after the party ended. 1 week later, the first safety meeting did not happen in a ballroom, a boardroom, or any place with polished speeches prepared in advance. It happened in a training room beside the marina, where folding chairs faced a whiteboard, coffee came from a dented metal urn, and the people closest to the daily work arrived first. Servers, deckhands, kitchen runners, cleaners, maintenance crew, security staff, the ones who knew which doors stuck, which radios failed, which corners swallowed sound, and which instructions looked good on paper but broke under pressure. Grace arrived 5 minutes early in a plain navy coat, her blonde hair tied back with the same wine-red ribbon. She carried a small notebook, not a presentation folder. Will was already there, standing near the back with no champagne, no photographers, and no speech waiting in his hand. His ivory blazer was gone. In its place was a simple gray sweater over a collared shirt, and somehow that made him look less important and more present. Sophie sat at a side table with colored pencils and a paper cup of blueberry yogurt, watched by the same pediatric nurse who had checked her on the yacht. She was healthy, bright-eyed, and proud to be included for the first 10 minutes before her doctor's appointment nearby. When she saw Grace, she ran to her and hugged her around the waist. "I told my doll about you," Sophie said. Grace crouched, smiling softly. Did she believe the pancake breathing? "She is practicing." We'll watch the exchange without interrupting. That was new for him. Waiting. Letting affection belong first to the person who had earned it. When the meeting began, one executive tried to open with a prepared statement about Harrington Hospitality's commitment to excellence. Grace listened for exactly 12 seconds before lifting her hand. "May I ask something?" The room turned to her. The executive paused. "Of course." Grace looked around at the staff, not the executives. Who here has ever reported a problem and felt ignored because your job title was too small? No one moved at first. Then a cleaner raised her hand. A deckhand followed. Then a kitchen runner. Then nearly half the room. Will stood at the back and felt each raised hand like a line in a report he should have read years ago. Grace nodded, not surprised. That is where safety failed before the door ever locked. The whiteboard stayed blank for a moment. Then she wrote 3 words in black marker. Listen before ranking. She turned back to the room. A warning is not more true because it comes from a manager. A child crying behind a door does not care who has authority. Smoke does not wait for approval. A loose railing does not respect a title. The first person who notices may be the person carrying plates, mopping floors, or changing trash bags. If your system teaches people to look upward before listening downward, your system is already late. The room went quiet, but not with shame this time. With recognition. People began speaking. A deckhand described a camera blind spot near the lower stairs. A server explained that service radios often cut out near the galley. A cleaner mentioned that some staff were afraid to use emergency channels because managers treated it as overreacting. Will wrote everything down himself. No assistant filtered it. No executive summarized it into softer language. Sophie watched him from the side table and whispered to the nurse, "Daddy is doing homework." Grace heard it and almost smiled. By the end of the meeting, the whiteboard was crowded with changes. Child location check-ins every 15 minutes. Unlocked emergency override access for trained crew. Radio priority codes for children and medical concerns. Mandatory response to all staff warnings. And a rule printed in large letters at the bottom. No concern is dismissed because of the uniform it comes from. Afterward, Will approached Grace while the room emptied. "You changed more in 90 minutes than my consultants changed in 3 years," he said. Grace closed her notebook. "Your consultants were probably listening to people who already had permission to speak." He nodded. "And you?" She looked towards Sophie, who was carefully tying a tiny wine-red ribbon around her doll's arm. "I listen for the ones who do not." Sophie ran over with the doll and held it up. Now she can be brave too. Grace touched the ribbon gently. She already was. Will looked at his daughter, then at Grace, then at the staff still gathered in small groups around the whiteboard, speaking with a confidence they had not entered with. For the first time in his career, he understood that leadership was not standing above a room with a glass raised high. It was making sure the quietest voice had a clear path to be heard. 3 months later, the Harrington Star returned to the Hudson under a softer kind of light. There was no champagne tower on the upper deck this time. No launch speech. No string quartet hired to make wealth sound elegant. Instead, rows of staff members moved through practical drills while supervisors watched from clipboards that no longer felt like weapons. A cleaner tested a radio near the lower corridor and smiled when the signal came through clearly. A deckhand checked the new child safety monitor at the stairwell. A kitchen runner pressed the priority alert button and heard the bridge answer in less than 5 seconds. Grace stood near the service stairs with her notebook open, her wine-red ribbon moving gently in the river wind. She was still a waitress on some nights. Still paid rent. Still took late shifts when she needed to. But on Harrington vessels, her name was now printed on the safety training schedule as consultant. Not hero. Not symbol. Consultant. That mattered to her. Heroes were displayed. Consultants were listened to. Will stood a few feet away in a simple navy jacket, no glass in his hand, watching Sophie walk beside Louise from maintenance as he showed her how the new staff call button worked. Sophie wore a yellow raincoat and carried the doll with the tiny wine-red ribbon around its arm. She looked older than she had that night, not because 3 months had changed her much, but because fear no longer owned the memory. When she saw Grace, she ran toward her, stopping just before impact, as if remembering grown-up knees were not always ready. Grace laughed softly and crouched. Blueberry breathing still working? Sophie nodded. But now I use strawberry breathing too. Advanced technique, Grace said. We'll watch them with a smile that stayed quiet. He had made changes people could measure. New locks, new sensors, new protocols, anonymous staff reporting, mandatory response rules. But the change he felt most was smaller and harder to put into a report. He listened differently. To footsteps outside Sophie's room. To hesitation in a deckhand's voice. To the pause before someone decided whether their concern was worth saying. Grace closed her notebook and looked toward the river. The system is better, she said. Will nodded. Because you told the truth. Because people finally had to hear it. He accepted the correction. Sophie came back, carrying 2 paper cups of cocoa from the refreshment table, one for herself and one for Grace. Daddy said you are the reason the boat listens now, she said. Grace looked at Will. He lifted both hands slightly, innocent and not quite. I may have said something close to that. Grace took the cocoa. Boats do not listen. People do. Sophie considered this. Then people should be more like boats with better radios. Will laughed, and Grace smiled into her cup. The sun lowered behind Manhattan, turning the windows gold. For a moment, the yacht looked almost like it had on the night everything changed. But Grace knew the difference. Beauty was not the promise anymore. Attention was. As the final drill ended, the bridge captain's voice came through every radio on board, clear and steady. Child safety check complete. All stations confirmed. Staff members answered one by one. Kitchen clear. Deck clear. Maintenance clear. Service clear. Grace listened to each voice, and something in her chest settled. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of a door staying open because someone had finally fixed the hinge. Will stepped beside her, leaving comfortable space. There will be another meeting next month, he said. If you are willing. Paid fairly. Paid fairly. Staff first. Always. She nodded. Then I will be there. Sophie slipped one small hand into her father's and the other into Grace's. Only for a second. Only because she wanted both adults to look at the water with her. No one made it more than it was. That was the gift. Some moments are too honest to be dressed up. Below them, the river moved dark and patient. Above them, the yacht lights came on one by one, not hiding the shadows this time, but helping people see where to step. Grace had not saved Sophie with noise. She had saved her by listening when listening was inconvenient. And Will had learned that power was not the ability to speak over everyone. It was the responsibility to make sure the smallest cry could reach the highest deck. The quiet ones do not always speak first. Sometimes they are the only ones who hear what matters.